that form. I'm Katie. My pronouns are she and her. I'm from LGBT Foundation. We're a national charity based in Manchester. And yeah, I'm really, really excited to do this session with you today. Just bear with me while I share my slides with you all. And of course, please do shout if you can't see the slides because that would be an issue, but hopefully everybody can. So yeah, this session is really, really exciting because at LGBT Foundation, we actually have 10 different modules that all deep dive into different areas of LGBT inclusion. But this is kind of a combination of all 10 really, in terms of like taking the really kind of crucial elements of certain modules. And we've essentially put together a top 10 tips for you on how to be LGBTQ plus inclusive. So I'm really, really excited about this session. I hope it will be really kind of beneficial for you, and hopefully there'll be something for everyone to take away, and it doesn't really matter what stage you're at on this journey. So I'm just going to go straight into it. Oh no, mine's also been quite slow moving on. That's unusual. There we go. So I wanted to start here, which is to get you thinking about in which areas of health, and that's supposed to say do LGBT communities experience health inequalities. So I just wanted you to have a think about that, because I think this is a really good place to start in terms of why we even need to have top 10 tips of how to improve our services and improve our practice. So spoiler alert, it's in every single area of health. So this is a quote by Dr. Michael Brady, who said, in every area where we ask the questions, LGBT people have poorer outcomes. And I'm going to be talking about like asking those specific questions later on in the session. But essentially, when it comes to like sexual health, mental health, domestic abuse, cancer, we are seeing poorer outcomes when it comes to LGBTQ plus people. And a question that I want you to have is why, and also what can we do to improve those numbers? So tip number one then is understanding those barriers to access. So I'm going to be sending a pack after today because we've only got like 45 minutes, and we've got lots and lots of like documents and further reading on this, lots of research. So I would really encourage you to have a look at the pack that we will send out afterwards. But essentially, people are not accessing healthcare for a number of reasons. So as you can see there, 13% have experienced some form of unequal treatment from healthcare staff because they're LGBT, as well as experiencing it themselves. As you can see, 23% have witnessed negative remarks against LGBT people. So naturally, if somebody sees something happening, they're very unlikely to like access healthcare themselves. And we have a lot of like anecdotal evidence about that as well. 14% have avoided treatment for fear of something happening, so fear of direct discrimination on the basis of their identity. This one always really shocks me because I think this is quite high. 5% have been pressured or encouraged to access services to question or change their sexual orientation when accessing healthcare services. So what we're talking about there is actually conversion therapy, which is not available on the NHS anymore, but is definitely available in a private setting. And so the fact that healthcare professionals are still recommending it to people is extremely concerning for me. And then another stat that I think is relevant is about 19% of people aren't out to a healthcare professional about their sexual orientation. And we see this number rise significantly when it comes to bisexuality, probably because of the stigma that we see a lot of bisexual people experience. So that fear of kind of opening up about their identity increases. Now, some of you might be thinking, but is it always relevant? But we want people accessing healthcare to feel like they can be themselves and talk about issues that are relevant to them. And often their sexual identity is actually highly relevant to their healthcare. So tip two then is all about terminology. So it's really important to get language right. I know that the terms can be a bit overwhelming. I know that there's a lot of fear of actually making a mistake. And again, I am going to talk about that. But if we do demonstrate that we know the terms, or we at least have a kind of baseline understanding of the terms, then that's a really great kind of exercise in demonstrating inclusion. You're also showing that person respect. And actually, it goes against the Equality Act if you're kind of purposefully getting someone's like identity wrong, or using terms in a kind of in a way that could be deemed like offensive as well. So like not respecting somebody's identity. Naturally, we're all human, mistakes happen, but it's that kind of repeated offence, or just not making that conscious effort to respect someone's identity that I'm talking about. So I'm not going to actually go into all of these terms now, and the reason for that is there's lots to get through today, and we actually have an amazing module that you can access, which is our GM Cancer session, where that goes through every single definition. I'm also going to be sending out, again, as part of this pack, a document that has all of the definitions on, but I'd really encourage you to check out the GM Cancer module that was created with LGBT Foundation, that goes through all of the terminology, all of the language, as well as have a look at the pack that I send out afterwards. I just didn't want to take up too much time today kind of going through every single definition, but I still wanted to stress that knowing this and having a look at terms is, certainly important. You might be thinking, well, that list wasn't very long. What about this term? I've met somebody that has this. What about that like term? So again, I just wanted to acknowledge as well that even regardless of learning all the definitions or going over all of the definitions, that people use different words to describe themselves and their attraction to others all the time, and language actually changes and evolves as well. So don't get too bogged down around those definitions. I know that kind of seems like I've contradicted myself there, because it is really important, but you don't need to know everything about a particular like identity. It's more about kind of mirroring the person, having that base understanding. But sometimes that might be worth looking up are like asexual, pansexual, agender as well, because you might certainly come across people that have those identities as well. And it's kind of for your own like confidence to have a quick Google in terms of what they actually mean. But you can also ask the person. People are really afraid to do this. We really encourage this actually at LGBT Foundation, that if somebody says to you, oh, I'm pansexual, if you just say in a respectful way, like, oh, I've never came across that before. Do you mind just explaining a little bit more about that so I understand? People are usually more than happy to kind of have a quick like explanation, so that they, are actually receiving the service that they want. So don't be afraid to ask, as long as you're kind of asking in that like respectful manner and not being kind of nosy or asking it in like a personal way. So tip number 3 then is pronouns. So in a similar vein, the GM Cancer module goes into pronouns in a lot more detail, but I'm conscious that there might be people here today that don't even know what pronouns are, might not have ever kind of came across them or anything like that. And essentially, pronouns are words that we use to describe ourselves and other people. There's some examples there on the screen. So pronouns weren't invented by trans and non-binary people. I feel like that's a massive misconception. We actually are taught about pronouns in primary school as part of like English language. So it's not this new thing. What's new, or I suppose newer, I should say, is the idea of not assuming how someone identifies and not assuming what people's pronouns are. The one that I do want to draw attention to is they, them, because people that identify as non-binary, whose identity, it isn't like male or female and is something outside of that, or perhaps a combination of the two, they tend to use they, them pronouns. And a question that I often get is, oh, but it doesn't make sense, it's incorrect grammar. And I always like to share the like bake-off analogy, which is when, and I hope most of you have watched Bake Off before, but when they're kind of talking about each cake that's being made and they don't know who's cooked each one, they all use they them pronouns. They talk about the cake and they say, oh, they've actually used this icing, or they've underbaked it. And they're talking about one person, not plural, because that's another misconception, is they is only used for plural. So I think the problem with they then that people struggle with is actually having a visual of the person and having to work against that. So if you're kind of meeting somebody who is more stereotypically female, for example, and then they say that their pronouns are they, them, that's the hard part, I think, for people, is to be like, oh, okay, I was expecting she, her, and it's not she, her, it's they, them. And so that's the challenge, but it's actually not incorrect grammar. I hope that makes sense. Obviously, like as I'm talking through all of this, please pop questions in the chat because there will be a Q&A at the end. So tip number 4 then is around avoiding assumptions. So I've kind of already touched on this, but this links to language massively around just like avoiding assumptions in order for your conversations and your reactions to people to be as inclusive as possible. So this is a very human thing. Assumptions are made by everybody every single day. We all do it. And instead of basing our understanding of people and events on what we observe or what we know to be, an absolute fact, we do tend to make judgments or assumptions kind of based on our own beliefs, our own expectations, etc. So I wanted to start there by just acknowledging that this is a very human thing. And essentially the tip here is to be aware of that and to be really mindful of the assumptions that you're making. So let's break that down a little bit more in terms of why. Why do people make assumptions and end up kind of asking disrespectful questions? So an example of a disrespectful question would be like, are you gay or straight? Now, that doesn't sound all that offensive, really, but it is just kind of it's very binary, first of all, in terms of just giving the person 2 options. Another one is why, or how do you know that you're trans, or how do you know that you're gay? I think people ask that one with the best intentions usually, but actually it certainly lands in quite a disrespectful way. People assume things about not only someone's gender, but also who they're with. So we hear it all the time of people having their partner with them, and then it gets assumed to be their sister or like a parent and things like that. So they're the kind of assumptions that I'm talking about, as well as assumptions about a person's identity and their gender, assumptions about their pronouns, like I just spoke about. So this all happens mainly just out of pure kind of not really understanding about the LGBTQ plus experience. So again, it's not usually in any sort of bad intent. It's more just not fully understanding. It can also be rooted in a bit of fear, a bit of discomfort about not only their own identities, but other people's identities, and perhaps their own lack of understanding as well. I talk to a lot of people in training sessions who tend to feel very uncomfortable with their own lack of confidence, and actually that's why mistakes are happening even more, because they're being a bit blunter or they're just avoiding it completely, and it's because they don't have that confidence. And as I kind of mentioned with the whole are you gay or straight, or are you male or female, that's approaching people in a very kind of binary way, just giving them 2 options rather than the spectrum that we kind of know people to be on. So I am going to empower you with a few useful questions to add to your vocab. So a really simple one is just, what pronouns do you use? This is something that I now use all the time. I'm so used to it. If there was time today to kind of do introductions, it shouldn't be in a pressured way, people shouldn't have to share their pronouns, but it's just a really useful habit to get into, is just checking. I tend to always just introduce myself with mine, and then that gives that other person that I'm talking to that opportunity to share back if they want to. And then if I don't know, or I don't have the opportunity to ask them, just not making any assumptions, just keeping my language very neutral and using like they, them, or using their name, just not making any assumptions. So again, another great example is asking what is their name or their pronouns. I had that recently when I was on like an interview panel. I missed introductions. So when we were kind of reviewing the people that we were like interviewing, I kept saying, who, I kept asking about people's names, their pronouns, and using they, them, because I'd missed introduction, so I didn't know how people identified, and things like that. Partner is a great word to add to your vocab as well. Rather than saying like, obviously husband, wife, boyfriend, girlfriend, assuming that as well. But by just saying partner, you're not assuming anything about the gender of that person that might have kind of accompanied somebody to the hospital or to the doctors. So it's a really great gender neutral word. And again, just even in your day-to-day life, if somebody's talking about like going on a date or their families, it's a great kind of word to get used to, because you don't want to be in that situation where you say like, oh, that's so great about your husband, or that, and you're just kind of jumping to conclusions without meaning to. So they're very kind of useful in all contexts. Ones that are a bit more on like a need to know basis, obviously you don't necessarily need to ask these questions all the time. How do you identify your sexual orientation? As you can see, the difference with that compared to are you gay or straight, it's such a beautifully open question. So how do you identify your sexual orientation? It just gives that person that opportunity to say, I'm gay, I'm pansexual, I'm bisexual, I'm straight, anything that they want. Even just like, I'm not sure, I'm figuring it out. It's just such a lovely open question. And again, how do you identify your gender? It gives people the opportunity to say male, female, but also non-binary, agender, genderqueer, etc. And then what does that identity mean for you is going into a little bit more detail. So I think this one's great, particularly on a one-to-one service, because lots of people identify as non-binary, for example, but everyone will have a very different experience or a different way that they express that gender. So for example, you might meet somebody who's non-binary, and I'm just using this as an example, who likes to express a bit more feminine. And then you might meet somebody else who, a bit more masculine or completely gender neutral. You might meet somebody who's non-binary, who doesn't mind what pronouns. You can use he, you can use she. And then you might meet somebody else, again, who's non-binary, that, like only uses they, them. So it's allowing for any differences by kind of digging a little bit deeper and getting to know the person that you're supporting a bit better. So hopefully those questions are useful for you. Another thing that's quite useful in terms of inclusive interactions then is what to do if someone comes out to you. So definitely thank them for telling you. If this, in the workplace especially, tell them that like they have your support. If it's a service user, again, obviously being quite like reassuring, thank them for telling you, because especially when we think of those barriers at the start and those health outcomes at the start, it might be easy for some people to just let you know their sexual orientation or their gender identity, but for others it might be extremely challenging. If somebody that you're working with or supporting comes out to you as trans or non-binary, then definitely double check around names and pronouns, like, oh, do you want me to start using a different name for you? Or like, can I just check your pronouns? There might not be any change yet if they're just kind of figuring themselves out, but if there is, obviously you want to be respectful of that. Obviously double checking who they're out to. Remember not to out them to anyone. Definitely like make sure your confidentiality policies include about a person's sexual orientation and their gender identity, and the kind of course around sharing that information. And then of course check if there's anything that you can do to support them and signpost them. And I'm going to be sharing some organisations at the end in terms of signposting as well. And then this is the big one that people love, is what to do when you get it wrong, what to do when you make a mistake. So definitely the first thing is to stay calm. I used to do this a lot around kind of like if I misgendered somebody, so if I got somebody's pronouns wrong, I'd be like so apologetic and panicked and like, oh God, I didn't mean to, I'm so sorry. And actually the better thing to do is to stay a bit calmer and not kind of go into defense mode, and listen to the person who's letting you know that you've made a mistake. Definitely apologize, definitely acknowledge, like, you know, that you've kind of made that mistake and got it wrong. I think that's important and can mean a lot to the person on the receiving end. Perhaps you want to thank them for telling you. Again, especially when it comes to misgendering, people get that all the time. So we speak to trans people that, you know, if they're getting their coffee in the morning, they'll get misgendered, then they'll get on the bus and get misgendered, then they go into work and get misgendered. And it's like a constant thing, sadly. So then when they're accessing healthcare and it happens, they might just be like, I'm not going to say anything. So if they've actually had the courage and the strength to say, oh, actually, I use these pronouns, or actually I identify as male, etc., it might be nice to just say that you appreciate them, you know, telling you. And then obviously the final thing is to move on and then to commit to doing better. So obviously definitely, especially if you know, as they've told you, not making that mistake again with them. So that can be like practicing in the mirror, saying it a few times before an appointment, just to make sure that you have it in your head, this person's identity, the pronouns they use, so you're not making those quick, impulsive assumptions next time you see them. So tip number 5 then. Again, this is something that I get feedback on as one of the hardest things to do if you're someone that's looking to be more LGBTQ plus inclusive, and that is challenging like prejudice, negative remarks, direct discrimination, indirect discrimination. So hopefully this will be somewhat helpful for you. So I think the first thing is actually knowing what it looks like in all its forms. I think when we think about discrimination, everybody has a different image in mind. And I think it's good for everyone to be aware of all of the different forms. I'm going to show a list on the next slide. Then being clear on all the different ways that you can challenge. So who can you report to? What policies are in place in your organisation? What's the line of command? Is there like a warning like process? All of the things like that. Again, I speak to people that don't know that, like don't know who to go to if something happens, or aren't sure of the process. They might not want to get somebody into trouble, but they also want to raise it. So I think really empowering teams with that knowledge so that they know who to go to. Definitely knowing the law and the protections that people are entitled to. So brushing up on the Equality Act, of course, the Gender Recognition Act, hate crime law, all of that kind of thing. And just knowing your strengths as a person. Are you in a position of leadership? Are you quite a confident person? And if not, maybe you're the person that writes the policy. So maybe your role can be actually more making sure the policies are inclusive. Having just a think about what your role in, because we don't expect everybody to kind of go out there guns blazing and kind of fighting the fight, but it's about knowing your strengths and what you can do to reduce anything happening in the organisation, and of course seizing opportunities to make the whole place a more inclusive like culture as well, because then it's less likely to even happen in the first place. So here's a bit of a list of what certain types of like negative behaviours towards LGBTQ plus people look like. So certainly using derogatory terms, so slurs, heckling or harassment. We have a whole module actually on all of this that goes into detail about like the level of harassment LGBT people can experience and the kind of data around that, and it is really shocking. Sexual harassment as well, so a lot of lesbian and bisexual women receive a lot of sexual harassment in the workplace as well, so that's definitely something to look out for. Obviously, as I've mentioned before, kind of deliberately or repeatedly misgendering someone. Jokes is a big one that I hear about all the time. If the butt of the joke is someone's identity, maybe don't say it, or maybe challenge that person. Something that I hear is like, oh, well, I have a gay mate that finds that joke really funny. And it's like, well, just, that's great. But just because that one person is quite resilient or has like a darker sense of humor, that doesn't mean all gay people are going to find that joke funny. Obviously not hiring somebody because they are LGBT, or excluding people from events or spaces, and obviously actually refusing to support someone because they are LGBT. So these are all the types of things to certainly be aware of. So how to respond then? So this is more like steps that you can take around like having challenging conversations with people, because obviously the first thing it says there is lead with empathy. Now, if somebody says something really offensive, you're not exactly going to lead with empathy, but I'm talking more about the negative remarks or the negative attitudes that people might have, where it's more based on a lack of understanding. So for example, like, I don't really get why we need a gender neutral bathroom. Like, I just think that's a bit silly, that kind of thing, so it's not super offensive, it's that person's opinion, but it does veer into the more negative side. And so leading with empathy can be really good, of like, I totally understand your point of view, I absolutely hear what you're saying, but then lead with like everyone statements. So like, everyone deserves to be treated with dignity and respect. So that's why it's important to use correct name and pronouns for someone. And that's just an example. And then finding that common ground, like, you're all here for the same reasons. You all want to make the service better and to have more people access it. So I know that we all care about making sure everybody has access to healthcare. How do you think we can get the message out there? And we found that this is a really useful tool to kind of make things happen and push things forward, rather than things becoming a bit of a battle, because that's certainly not what we want to see happening in organisations. And again, just to reiterate, in the workplace, definitely you can complain informally, or actually raise a grievance as well. And again, I would really encourage you to have a look at what's in place there, to kind of challenge certain comments or phrases, actually being specific. So saying that term is actually offensive to trans people and it goes against our equality and diversity policy. An appropriate time to talk about X would actually be X. So rather than just saying like, oh, you can't say that now, or actually that's really offensive, and the person's kind of sat there not knowing why or what they've done wrong, and they're going to obviously feel defensive. So you're actually, letting them know that it's in policy, and you're also giving them another term. And again, we've got a whole module on how to improve the workplace and change the culture, which is our LGBT inclusive workplaces module. And definitely we encourage training and policies and also procedures around discipline as well that ties into all of this. So tip number 6 is intersectionality, massively important. Again, LGBT Foundation have worked with you before in this area with the QTPOC work that we did. So if anyone that doesn't know what that stands for, that's queer, trans and intersex people of colour. So it wasn't myself, but we did work with you around recruitment, and making sure that like anti-racist practices were really like embedded in your recruitment, and in your policies as well. So I really encourage you to look at that work, and we're kind of like jumping off that, and reminding you to definitely consider intersectionality again with all of this. So this is about not seeing people as all the same, essentially. So especially with the acronym, I feel like LGBT people kind of get lumped together, and actually even just within the acronym, the L can be very different to the G and can be very different to the B, etc. But also even within that, there's of course different protected characteristics that make up a person. So that definitely includes race, that includes perhaps like nationality, disability, age, etc. So what we're thinking here when you're being inclusive is to really be person-centered and consider the like multi-layers of someone's identity, but also the kind of multitude of barriers as well. So intersectionality is a term that can be quite diluted. It's become a bit of a buzzword. It is really important though. So I just wanted to reiterate to be specific as well when we're talking about this. So it shouldn't be used in like a general sense. So instead of saying like, oh, we want to be inclusive of intersectional groups, be specific, like the QTPOC work. So be like, we want to improve things for people that experience racism, experience sexism, or specifically talk about the people that you're talking about, like like people who people who have disabilities who are also LGBT, as an example. So yeah, it's about being specific, and also it's about considering not just the multi-layers of someone's identity, but also the barriers they experience as well. So LGBT people, as we know, experience barriers to healthcare, but this increases if they've got more protected characteristics. So again, more kind of prejudice and discrimination, and especially kind of previous experiences. Their perception as well of how they're going to be treated is more negative. And sometimes there can be a lack of explicit inclusion of them. So a lot of people don't feel seen in certain services. Obviously, physical barriers should be considered as well. Is it actually physically accessible? As well as other barriers like poor public transport links and things like that. Religious or cultural barriers. So we talk to a lot of people who find it really difficult when their appointments are always scheduled like during prayer times and things like that. Obviously, cultural appropriation and kind of marketing that might be well intended, but actually make somebody feel even more like left out. And then naturally spaces not being welcoming or safe or inclusive with people who have certain mental health problems or physical health problems, etc. So tip 7 then is around monitoring. So I love this phrase: if we're not counted, we don't count. So that is a quote from our CEO actually, which is around, it's we as LGBT people need to be included and counted. Otherwise the service is never going to be that inclusive. So we still lack loads of evidence around LGBT health and inequalities. And people tend to ask me really specific questions about health sometimes. And unfortunately, we don't have a huge amount of kind of studies. There's a few, but not loads. And we've had to do studies ourselves as well. And the main thing is because people aren't asking people how they identify. So they're not asking about gender. They're not asking about sexual orientation, or if they are, they're not asking in an inclusive way. So the best practice example is on the screen there. That is the NHS recommendation. So again, it has all the options. It's got prefer not to say, but it's way more inclusive. Obviously, asking the question, it doesn't fix everything really quickly, but it definitely lets us start to address any issues, like why are there low numbers of a certain group of people. And again, you guessed it, we've got a whole module on this as well, which is our module 8, which is like a 2-hour in-depth look of how to improve monitoring as well. So yeah, we have already touched on this really, but we do encourage this to be more person-centered. So then you're able to give targeted and more appropriate advice. So if a particular GP surgery, for example, knows that they get a high number of trans people accessing them, then they'll know then to kind of make that effort to have information about hormones and signposting and celebrating pride and just making that space as safe as possible. Or the opposite, if no trans people are accessing your service, it's asking the question why. Obviously helps us using the right words as well. When we have that data, we're not going to misgender somebody if we have that kind of information on the system. It removes the onus from the individual that they have to be the ones to tell us all the time. We should be the ones asking. Definitely builds a really good picture of your workforce or your client base, etc. As I said, it helps us know who isn't accessing. I think it does really well to demonstrate that you've thought about a particular group of people and accept them. It definitely is like a signal for an LGBT person to see those questions on the form and think, oh, I feel a bit safer now because they're considering my identity. Obviously, you should definitely reassure them about confidentiality and things like that. And in general, if every service was collecting this information, our like national picture would be a lot more accurate as well. So we've got about 5 minutes left before questions, and there's about 3 tips left as well. So tip number 8 is inclusive hiring then. So again, this is something that you've already looked at, which I think is amazing. But just to reiterate that, you definitely want to be looking at your equal opportunities policies, making sure they're inclusive. Definitely, as I've just said, asking questions that, gets a sense of who's applying for jobs. And who isn't. Definitely showcasing inclusive benefits. So shared parental leave, for example, making sure that is clearly inclusive of LGBT couples. It will, I think it's a really good idea to like consult with the community as well, survey. That's something that we did as an organisation, actually. We looked at why we had historically a low number of people of colour applying for jobs here and people of a certain age. So we really looked into that and kind of like surveyed the community, which I would really, I don't think people shouldn't shy away from the gaps that they have. It should just be addressed. Having more visible commitment. So visible commitment to improvement. When you update your policies, actually share that, put it on the website, put it on social media, share that your organization's receiving training, share that this is happening today, marking key dates on the calendar, like Pride, things like that. Inclusion statement, so that's our example on the screen there, which is being upfront about the gaps and who you would really encourage or would like to see apply for your roles. And again, being clear about the support offered to trans people. So like paid sick leave, extra leave if they need it around their like transition, financial support even we've seen before. Obviously, that will vary organisation to organisation, but some kind of visible support to any trans people that work for you is really, really important. Policies then I've spoken about like before, and being specific and really naming it. So actually include in your policies homophobia, transphobia, and biphobia. Like actually say in your zero tolerance policy that you won't tolerate that. Actually say who the policy is inclusive of. So mention LGBT people. And who that actually means, rather than just like using the acronym. Like it includes non-binary people, it includes, anybody that identifies within the LGBTQ umbrella. And again, as I said, mentioning the Equality Act, mentioning the Gender Recognition Act, and any kind of like other important law that should be included. And I wanted to give some specific advice around trans inclusion policies as well. So again, that clear commitment to supporting trans people and making sure it's inclusive of non-binary identities as well. Perhaps information on language and terminology, especially for any non-trans or cis people who are having a look at the policies. It might be helpful for them to like have a few definitions, terminology, and understanding about pronouns. So making a policy not just a policy, an actual useful document, or an actual educational document, I mean. Guidance on facilities, as that's always something that comes up. Guidance on dress code, things like that. Definitely that their trans status will be like protected and confidential. Support and what that looks like for somebody who is actually going through the process of actually transitioning, and also how to change their name and their gender like marker on workplace systems. Guidance for managers as well as other employees on how to support someone, and again those like benefits as well, like special leave. And finally then, pretty much just on the line, is around, so like tip number 10 is around just your role in improving the culture of your team, of your like building, of healthcare in general. So don't think small, like start thinking of yourself as an individual and what you can do, but actually let that thought grow and actually think about it in terms of your role within a much wider system in terms of improving those poorer health outcomes for LGBTQ plus people. And again, there's so many ways to do this. So definitely attending training sessions like you've all done today, sharing this recording with people as well, making a conscious effort with your language. Perhaps you're somebody that's like, oh, I've never asked like an open question before about someone's sexual orientation, or I never ask someone's like pronouns because I just wait for them to tell me. Really challenge yourself to like give it a go and be a bit more or a bit less passive, I should say. Obviously, like policies I keep banging on about, but any sort of handbook with that explicit reference to no tolerance of homophobia, biphobia and transphobia, that's so important when we're trying to have an inclusive culture. And really going into detail of what that means, and listing examples of what won't be tolerated. So mention jokes, mention certain like language that won't be tolerated, mention harassment, be as specific as possible. And that's our like recommendation there, which kind of really does list everything and also goes into racism, sexism, ageism, etc. Really covers all of the protected characteristics, which is of course important. And not just celebrating Pride and looking at the LGBT community as just one whole group, but making sure you put particular focus on those identities that are often overlooked, and like bisexuality is definitely a good example of that. So I'm not going to read out all of this, but I just want to make it clear that we have loads of organisations that we can signpost. I'm going to be sharing this afterwards with a list of all the kind of contact details of different organisations, including ourselves, of course. We don't expect people to just know everything and not need any support. We would really encourage you to get in touch if you need support. And here's just some examples of some key dates and events that you can definitely get behind or make more LGBT focused. So obviously you've got the Pride, we're about to go into LGBT History Month in February, but even things like Stoptober and things like that straight away aren't, of course, just for LGBT people, but again, we see really high rates of smoking and drinking in the LGBTQ plus community. So it's about making sure our